the gateway to the West. One of the great American cities, St. Louis, like any city, has its own identity and reputation. It's a city of life and culture. St. Louis is home to great art and a real sports center with 3 major teams. This video is made to help you, the viewer, better understand the history behind this great city. Although it may seem St. Louis is far away from us, its history is closer than we think. In addition to all the changes occurring within the city of St. Louis from the 1940s to the present day, the status of women in the city saw a tremendous shift. One of the most monumental times for women in St. Louis and throughout the nation was when women entered the workforce during World War II. As thousands of men were called into the front lines, women supported the war effort by doing the jobs that belonged to these men. 35,000 people, the majority of them being women, worked in the St. Louis Ordnance Plant, the largest ammunition packaging factory in the nation. During this time, women were given a wage and found a new sense of independence, unlike never before. Women also proved to be a recognizable force in the civil rights movement in St. Louis during the 1960s. One of the most influential women to the civil rights movement in the 60s and throughout the 70s was St. Louis native Maya Angelou, famous for her poetry and novels such as I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. In the 1970s through the 1980s, hundreds of women in St. Louis rallied to fight for female equality in the workforce, education, for sexual liberation, and for equality rights. Although women have made significant strides throughout their history in St. Louis, to this day, St. Louis has yet to have a woman hold the position of mayor. Although women make up 51% of the city's population, only 23% of businesses are owned by women in St. Louis. In addition, St. Louis was recently ranked last on list of the top 25 metropolitan cities for women entrepreneurs. However, there are several organizations today that are promoting equality for women in St. Louis, such as the League of Women's Voters, St. Louis chapter, and the Professional Women's Alliance, along with tension between races continued in St. Louis through the 20th century and into the 21st century. Racial and ethnic problems only seemed to grow as the city moved into the 1940s and 50s as white and African Americans began to settle into different parts of St. Louis. The white population began to settle throughout the suburban St. Louis counties and a few tracts surrounding Forest Park, but sticking mainly to the city's southern reaches. Though many of the whites were new arrivals to the St. Louis area, there were also a profound number of whites moving from the city to its suburbs, which was noticeable due to the collapsing white population in many central city tracts. As the whites moved to the suburbs, African Americans began to settle almost exclusively in the old industrial suburbs on the Illinois side and scattered outposts throughout northern St. Louis County. As settlement continued, separation and segregation became more apparent, and cities eventually became mini countries, each representing a different ethnic background. In the beginning of the 1900s, Carey Patch was mainly an Irish city, as well as Dogtown, located northwest of downtown St. Louis. Another area, known as the Hill, started as an Irish and German city, but in the 1890s, more and more Italians began influencing this area and would eventually claim it as their own. By 1950, St. Louis's population reached more than 850,000 people, with African Americans making up a majority of the newcomers. The more African Americans who migrated to St. Louis, the worse the tension became between whites and blacks, making this clash St. Louis's biggest problem, which still continues to this day. The first example of this growing tension came in June of 1942, when 150 black porters were laid off their jobs while thousands of white workers were hired. Though job opportunities opened up, the tension between whites and blacks continued to grow. On June 21, 1949, approximately 40 African American children were permitted to swim at the Fairgrounds Park pool. Nearly 200 whites surrounded the pool fence, leading to a violent outbreak later that day as the swimmers left the pool. Though several men, women, and children of both races were involved and hospitalized, no one was killed. The 1960s in the United States saw the biggest problems with racial tension. The African American Civil Rights Movement encompassed social movements in the United States whose goals were to end racial segregation and discrimination against Black Americans, and to secure legal recognition and federal protection of the citizenship rights enumerated in the Constitution and federal law. The movement was characterized by major campaigns of civil resistance. Between 1955 and 1968, acts of nonviolent protest and civil disobedience produced crisis situations and productive dialogues between activists and government authorities. An example of this civil resistance came on October 7, 1963, when 4 black teens were arrested for supposedly disturbing a business at a local bank. Instead of violent response, demonstrators sang hymns and peacefully protested against the unfair treatment of African Americans. On April 4, 1968, the African American community was dealt a hard blow. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. impacted not only the African American community, but the country as a whole. The day after he was shot, 75 St. Louis civil rights leaders met at the Mid-City Community Congress on Delmar to plan a memorial march for Palm Sunday, 2 days later. With everyone on edge, militants and moderates shouted at each other. Morris Hatchett, the World War II and head of the NAACP, stood firm against violence. In the mid-20th century, St. Louis exploded outwards from the city center in the years after World War II. In a nationwide trend propelled by the rise of the automobile and the disposable income of middle-class America. Until the 1930s, most of the extra city expansion was in suburban towns bordering the western edge of St. Louis and existing streetcar suburbs. Towns like Kirkwood, Maplewood, Webster Groves, Universal City, and Clayton. This expanding urban area meant that business communities and St. Louisians as a whole would suffer a loss of thousands of jobs and would see a decay of many older and historic neighborhoods within the downtown area. As a result of this, the city of St. Louis lost its leading edge. Yet, despite the major impact of the Great Depression, World War II, and a major expansion of the suburbs, the city of St. Louis would begin looking towards its future, with a series of bond initiatives beginning in 1944, as well as with the American Housing Act of 1949. These series of bond initiatives provided for a post-war public works program similar to the WPA, resulting in the Plaza Square Apartments, Chain of Rocks, River des Presses, Wilmore Parks, and various other civic improvements throughout the city. While the American Housing Act of 1949 allowed for the Land Clearance and Redevelopment Authority to buy and demolish the remaining slums and help bring aid back to the people of downtown St. Louis. In spite of massive modernization in the downtown and in the city's infrastructure, the hardest decades of St. Louis would face were looming ahead of it. In the decade from 1970 to 1980, St. Louis lost a bewildering 170,000 residents, resulting in about 30% of its population due to an economic depression hitting the Midwest and the Rust Belt. In the same decade, Buffalo would lose over 100,000 inhabitants, Pittsburgh over 100,000, New York nearly 700,000, and Detroit would lose over 300,000. Due to this, St. Louis subsequently saw a major increase in crime rates and general disenfranchisement with the urban living. To combat this growing urban decay, Mayor Vincent Schommel instituted a city beautification project known as Operation Brightside, which consisted of planting street trees and flowers along major streets, also providing summer jobs for city youth picking up litter in alleyways. Furthermore, Schommel introduced Operation Safe Street, which provided low-cost or free security measures, such as deadbolts and bars for windows. As a result of both programs, crime declined in targeted neighborhoods by an average of 30%, and crime continued to decline citywide through the rest of the 1980s. At the same time, as many neighborhoods were persevering through these problems, downtown St. Louis saw great growth in construction. Among the new crop of buildings was the tallest in the city, One Metropolitan Square, which soared to 593 feet, and the redevelopment of Union Station reopened in 1985. Downtown St. Louis, already functioning as a business and government center, would take on the additional role of sports center by the mid-1990s. The St. Louis Blues had played in the arena near Forest Park for nearly 30 years when it was announced that in 1994 they would move to the newly constructed Kiel Center. While just 1 year later, the Trans World Dome and the Los Angeles Rams would move to St. Louis in 1995. In just 3 years, downtown St. Louis had gone from hosting only the St. Louis Cardinals baseball team to 3 major sports. Since the early 2000s, St. Louis's core has been undergoing a renaissance that has seen a great number of rehabilitation and construction projects breathing life back into its great spaces. In the decade from 2000 to 2010, downtown St. Louis has more than doubled its population and has seen major redevelopment projects. St. Louis has seen 250 eventful years since its humble beginnings. The city has seen good and bad, and has emerged vibrant and continues to grow. St. Louis is a city that has a history like none other. It is a Midwest city with racial tensions, lack of women-owned businesses and politicians, yet has seemed to be able to rise to the occasion and reinvent itself at the inner city level. Even though there are riots and extreme tensions between protesters and police, this is something St. Louis has been able to handle in the past and looks like it's going to be able to handle even better in the future. Thanks for watching.